Nice, 1976, the jewel of the French Riviera. To understand the crime of the century, we must first understand the man who dreamed it. Albert Spaggiari was not born a criminal. He was a man of action, a paratrooper who had survived the brutal jungles of Indochina. He had seen death, he had seen betrayal, and he had developed a profound contempt for the safe, boring lives of the wealthy elite. After the war, he settled in Nice and opened a photography studio. But the quiet life of a wedding photographer was a slow death for a man like Albert. He looked at the high society of Nice, the bankers, the corrupt politicians, the bored millionaires, and he saw targets. He didn't just want their money. He wanted to humiliate the system that protected them. He chose the Société Générale for a reason. It was the symbol of French financial stability. The vault was considered a masterpiece of security. It sat in the heart of the city, surrounded by police patrols and constant surveillance. For months, Albert lived a double life. By day, he adjusted the lighting for portraits of brides. By night, he was a ghost in the streets, measuring the distance between manhole covers and the bank's foundation. He realized that while the bank spent millions on steel doors, they had spent almost nothing on the ground beneath them. They assumed the earth was their ally. They were wrong. Albert knew he couldn't dig a tunnel alone. He needed a very specific type of person. He went to Marseille, the dark heart of the French Mediterranean underworld. He didn't want common street thugs who would crack under pressure. He sought out veterans, men who knew how to use explosives and how to keep a secret. He recruited professional safecrackers and even a few men who worked in the city's public works department, men who knew the sewer maps like the back of their hands. This was the birth of the sewer rats. The recruitment process was like a scene from a spy novel. Meetings took place in abandoned warehouses and low-light cafes where the smell of cheap tobacco hid the tension in the air. Albert sold them a dream. He told them, "We aren't going to rob a bank. We are going to colonize it." He promised them that if they followed his plan, they would never have to work a day in their lives. But first, they had to become creatures of the dark. They had to be willing to spend months in the stench and filth of the ancient Roman sewers of Nice. The operation began in May 1976. The team set up a base in a rented villa outside the city, but their real work happened miles away, underground. The tunnels of Nice are a labyrinth of history and waste. To reach the bank, they had to navigate through pipes that were often less than 4 feet high. The heat was a constant enemy. Without proper ventilation, the temperature rose to nearly 50 degrees Celsius. The air was thick with methane and the overwhelming stench of raw sewage. They worked in absolute silence. No power tools were allowed in the early stages to avoid acoustic detection. Every stone was removed with a hand chisel. Every bucket of dirt had to be carried back through the sludge to a point where it could be disposed of without raising suspicion. They encountered massive roots from ancient trees on the Promenade des Anglais that had grown through the sewer walls, creating natural barriers. They found old, forgotten masonry from the time of the Italian occupation. Each obstacle took days to overcome. Their hands were constantly infected from the dirty water, and their lungs burned from the lack of oxygen. But Albert was always there, whispering encouragement, reminding them of the gold that lay just a few feet away. The bank's vault was equipped with state-of-the-art seismic sensors. These devices could pick up the vibration of a falling coin on the floor above. Albert knew this. To beat the sensors, he came up with a brilliant plan. He realized that the city of Nice was loud. He timed their heavy drilling to coincide with the passing of the heavy city buses on the street above. When a bus roared past, the rats would drill with everything they had for 5 seconds, then stop and wait for the next one. It was a slow, agonizing process. Sometimes they would wait for an hour just to get 30 seconds of drilling time. Spaggiari even went as far as to set up a test in the vault. He sent a Confederate into the bank to open a small savings account and observe the guards. Meanwhile, Albert was in the sewer directly below, banging on the pipes. His man inside reported that the guards heard nothing. The thick concrete of the floor was dampening the sound, and the vibration of the city traffic provided the perfect cover. The rats were winning the psychological war. The breakthrough happened on the evening of July 16th. It was a Friday. The bank had just closed for the weekend. When the final drill bit pierced the floor of the vault, a blast of cool, filtered air hit the men in the tunnel. It was the first clean air they had breathed in weeks. One by one, they climbed into the sanctuary of the vault. They were surrounded by 4,000 safety deposit boxes. What followed was not a panicked robbery, but an organized occupation. They brought in a massive hydraulic jack that weighed over 100 kilograms, dragging it through the mud and up into the vault. This machine allowed them to pop the doors of the boxes like they were made of tin. But Spaggiari insisted on a certain level of decorum. He had his men bring in a gas stove, steaks, and cases of high-end wine. While they worked, they feasted. They sat on piles of cash and ate dinner by candlelight, surrounded by millions of francs. They found the jewelry of the Countess of Paris. They found the secret ledgers of local politicians. They found things that were worth more than money: information. Spaggiari spent hours reading through private documents, laughing at the hypocrisy of the city's leaders. By Sunday night, the vault was a wreck. The floor was covered in empty velvet jewelry boxes, discarded documents, and the remains of their weekend picnic. They had taken an estimated 60 million francs, an astronomical sum in 1976, but they couldn't take everything. They had to leave behind millions more because they simply couldn't carry it through the sewers. As they prepared to leave, Spaggiari took a piece of charcoal from their stove. On the wall of the vault, he wrote the words that would make him a folk hero: sans armes, ni haine, ni violence. Without weapons, without hate, without violence. He wanted the world to know that they were professionals, not murderers. They slipped back into the sewers, disappeared into the night, and by the time the bank employees opened the doors on Monday morning, the sewer rats were already miles away, celebrating in a safe house. The police were humiliated. The French government was furious. A massive manhunt was launched, and eventually the pressure began to break the team. One of the members was caught in a routine check, and under intense interrogation, he gave up Spaggiari's name. Albert was arrested in October 1976, but even in handcuffs, he was the smartest man in the room. He spent months in prison, preparing for his final performance. In March 1977, he was brought to the Palais de Justice in Nice for a hearing. He had prepared a fake map and a complex story to distract the judge. While the judge was leaning over his desk, trying to decipher Albert's drawings, Spaggiari saw his moment. He stood up, ran across the room, and dove through the second-story window. He landed on the roof of a parked Renault, then jumped to the ground, where a friend was waiting on a motorcycle. They sped off through the narrow streets of the old town, leaving the police standing at the window in shock. It was the last time the French authorities would ever touch him. For the next 12 years, Albert Spaggiari lived as a legend. He traveled to Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. He underwent plastic surgery to change his appearance. He even gave interviews to French journalists from secret locations, mocking the police and the justice system. He became a symbol of the gentleman thief, a man who had beaten the system and escaped to tell the tale. But the life of a fugitive is a lonely one. He could never return to his beloved Nice. He lived in luxury, but he was always looking over his shoulder. He died in 1989 in a small house in Italy, never having spent a single day in prison for the robbery. His body was secretly driven across the border and left in front of his mother's house in Hyères, so he could finally rest in French soil. The money from the robbery was never fully recovered. Some say it is buried in the hills above Nice. Others say it was spent on a life of adventure. But the real legacy of Albert Spaggiari isn't the gold. It's the story of the man who went beneath the surface of the world to prove that nothing is truly secure. This has been Nice Noir Stories. The City of Light has many shadows. Until next time. The vault of Société Générale was closed and welded shut decades ago, but the echoes of Albert Spaggiari's laughter still haunt the narrow streets of Old Nice. His story became a myth, a dark fairy tale for a city that lives between the blinding sun and the deep, cold Mediterranean. But do not be fooled by the bright lights of the Promenade des Anglais. Every grand hotel, every shadowed alleyway in the hills of Simiez, and every luxury yacht anchored in the port has a story that the official tour guides will never tell you. Nice is a city of layers. Beneath the glamour lies a history of high-stakes heists, unsolved mysteries, and people who disappeared into the blue horizon. Today, we walked through the sewers with the rats. Next time, we will climb the marble stairs of the most famous hotels to uncover secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. We will talk about the scandals of the Belle Epoque and the modern mysteries that still baffle the French police. If you felt the chill of the underground today, if you were fascinated by the audacity of a man who challenged the world with nothing but a camera and a shovel, then stay with us. This is only the beginning of our journey into the dark heart of the Riviera. Subscribe to Nice Noir Stories. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the unknown. Leave a comment below. Do you believe the gold is still hidden in the hills of Provence? Or did it vanish with the man who lived without weapons, without hate, and without violence? I am your guide through the shadows. Until the next story, keep your eyes open. In Nice, the most beautiful things often hide the darkest secrets. Good night. And now, I leave you with the city itself. Listen to the waves of the Mediterranean and the heartbeat of the Promenade. Let the shadows of Nice tell you their own stories. Until next time.